The night air in Lagos was heavy with humidity, and inside the crowded hospital, Nandi moved quickly from one bed to another, her face calm but her eyes tired. She was a young nurse, respected for her dedication, but behind her uniform lay a mountain of struggles. At home, her widowed mother waited, often skipping meals so her younger brother could eat. Nandi's small salary barely covered rent and school fees, yet she never allowed her hardships to steal the gentleness from her heart. Every patient she touched felt not just care, but compassion. Her colleagues often wondered how she carried such light in a life filled with so much darkness. That evening, while finishing her shift, Nandi heard a soft commotion at the reception desk. A frail man, his clothes worn and his body weak, was being discharged. His treatment had ended not because he was healed, but because he could not pay the hospital bill. The guard stood at his side, ready to escort him out. His head hung low, shame written across his face, and his trembling hands clutched a crumpled note he could not afford to give. Nandi paused, her heart tightening. She had seen this scene before, but tonight, something about the man's quiet desperation struck her differently. She watched his shoulders shake as he whispered, "Please, just one more day. I'll find a way to pay." His voice cracked, but the guards were unmoved. Around them, staff averted their eyes, too busy or too indifferent to interfere. For a moment, Nandi stood frozen, her mind racing. She thought of her mother at home, waiting for the little money she would bring. She thought of her brother's school fees due soon. She thought of the bills piling on her own table. Every part of her life screamed that she could not afford another burden. Yet, when she looked back at the man's tear-streaked face, she felt a pull stronger than her fears. She stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "Wait," she said, her eyes locking on the clerk. "Don't discharge him yet." The guards paused, surprised. Nandi reached into her bag, her hand trembling as she pulled out her worn wallet. Inside was the last of her savings, but without hesitation, she placed the notes on the counter. The man's eyes lifted slowly, meeting hers. Shock and gratitude filled his gaze. In that moment, neither of them spoke further, but the seed of something life-changing had just been planted. The weak man sat on the hospital bench, his thin frame trembling as two guards stood over him. His eyes were sunken, his lips dry, and his voice cracked with humiliation as he whispered, "Please, I just need more time." But the guards, unmoved, shook their heads and pulled at his arm, preparing to escort him out into the night. Around them, nurses and patients pretended not to notice, unwilling to involve themselves in the shame of a man too poor to pay. His face burned with despair, tears glistening as he realized that sickness was not what would defeat him. It was poverty. Nandi stood nearby, clutching a clipboard, her heart pounding. She had seen many patients discharged for unpaid bills, but there was something about this man's broken spirit that tore at her. His voice carried the weight of someone who had already lost too much. The guards barked at him to stand, and as he struggled to rise, his knees buckled. He fell back onto the bench, his body trembling, and his eyes filled with silent pleas that no one seemed willing to answer. In that instant, Nandi could not look away. She felt the heaviness of her own worries, her mother waiting at home, her brother's school fees, her own empty wallet. Yet compassion was stronger than logic. Slowly, she stepped forward. The guards looked at her, confused, but she ignored their stares. She reached into her small bag and pulled out a thin wallet, worn at the edges. Inside lay her only savings, carefully kept for emergencies. Her fingers trembled as she counted the notes, each one carrying the sacrifice of skipped meals and sleepless nights. Without a word, she handed the money to the clerk and said firmly, "Clear as bill. Health comes before money." Her voice was soft but carried strength. The man, stunned, lifted his head. His eyes filled with disbelief and gratitude as he looked at her. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaking. But behind his weak smile, he quickly lowered his gaze, hiding the truth of who he really was. The next morning, the ward buzzed with whispers. Nurses huddled in corners, glancing at Nandi as she passed. Their voices were low, but sharp enough to sting. "Can you believe she used her own money?" one muttered. "She barely survives on her salary, yet she's paying for strangers." Another scoffed, shaking her head. "Kindness doesn't feed a family. She's foolish." The words floated through the air like needles, meant to pierce her spirit. Nandi kept her head high, pretending not to hear, but inside she felt the weight of their judgment pressing down. By midday, she was summoned to Matron Dube's office. The matron, a stern woman with a sharp tongue, sat behind her desk, glasses perched on her nose. She looked up at Nandi with disapproval, tapping her pen on a stack of files. "Nandi," she began, her voice cold, "I've been informed of your actions last night." She leaned forward. "You crossed professional boundaries. Paying a patient's bill is not your duty. Do you think the hospital will reimburse you? Do you think compassion will cover your rent or your mother's food?" Her tone grew harsher. "One day you will regret wasting what little you have." Nandi listened quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She could feel the sting of the words, but she refused to let them break her spirit. When the matron paused, waiting for an apology, Nandi simply smiled faintly and said, "Matron, Money can always be earned again, but dignity, once lost, is not so easy to recover. If I can help someone keep theirs, even just for a moment, then I have done my job as a nurse. The matron's eyes narrowed, clearly unimpressed, but Nandi did not waver. She left the office with her heart steady, even as more whispers followed her down the corridor. To her colleagues, she might seem naive. To her supervisor, reckless. But in her own heart, she knew compassion was worth more than all the money she could ever save. And though she walked away alone, there was a quiet strength in her steps, the kind that only comes from believing kindness matters most. Tawanda sat quietly in a corner of the ward, dressed in faded clothes that made him blend in with the struggling patients. To everyone else, he was just another poor man who had barely survived his illness. No one suspected the truth, that he was the hospital's new owner, sent undercover to see for himself how people were treated when money was out of reach. He had built his wealth far from here, but he knew hospitals often looked different on paper than in reality. He wanted to witness the truth without the polished speeches of managers or the fake smiles of staff. From the moment he entered, he had seen the coldness in many faces, the quick dismissal of patients who could not pay, the way dignity was stripped from those already in pain. Yet, in the middle of all that, one young nurse stood out. Nandi. She had not only treated him with respect, but had sacrificed her own savings to settle his bill. Even when mocked by her colleagues and scolded by her matron, she had stood tall, holding on to her belief that kindness was worth more than money. Tawanda observed her carefully, watching how she comforted patients with gentle words, how she stayed behind after shifts to check on those too weak to speak for themselves, how she smiled even when exhaustion lined her face. It wasn't just her actions with him that impressed him, it was the consistency of her heart. He had seen wealth buy loyalty, but what she gave came from a place no amount of money could purchase. As he lay back on the hospital bed at night, pretending to be weak, he thought of his late mother, who had been a nurse just like Nandi. She too had believed that compassion was the true medicine. For Tawanda, this undercover mission had already shown him the truth he needed to see. The hospital was failing in its humanity, but within it stood one woman proving what real care should look like. Quietly, he made a vow to remember Nandi's courage because soon, the truth about who he really was would come to light. A few days later, the ward was busier than usual. Patients lined up at the pharmacy desk, holding crumpled prescriptions, while nurses hurried between rooms. Tawanda, still dressed as a struggling patient, walked slowly toward the counter, holding a slip of paper. His steps were unsteady, and he pretended to be confused as he stared at the medical forms in his hands. The clerk at the desk barely glanced at him, waving him aside impatiently. "Fill it properly and come back," she said coldly, already turning to the next person in line. He shuffled away, looking lost, his face a mask of helplessness. Around him, others saw but quickly turned away. No one had the time, or perhaps the willingness, to help a man who looked like he could not afford even the cheapest medicine. His weak voice asked a question, but the clerk ignored him completely. For a moment, Tawanda stood in silence, testing not just the system, but the hearts within it. Then, like before, Nandi appeared at his side. She had just finished checking on another patient, yet she noticed his struggle immediately. Without hesitation, she took the papers from his trembling hands. "Don't worry," she said gently. "Let me help you." She guided him to a nearby chair, smoothed out the forms, and began filling them correctly. When she saw the cost of the medication listed, her heart sank. It was more than he could ever afford. Tawanda lowered his head, whispering, "I don't have enough." Nandi didn't pause. She reached into her bag again, pulling out a few folded notes. It wasn't much, but she placed them on the counter. "Health comes first," she said softly, just as she had before. "We'll figure out the rest later." Her sincerity struck him deeply. She had no reason to help, no reward waiting for her, yet she gave freely. While others passed by without a glance, Nandi offered dignity and hope. Tawanda watched her quietly, his heart heavy with emotion. This was not just kindness, it was courage, the rare kind that could not be faked. And in that moment, his respect for her grew beyond words. A week later, a notice was pinned to the ward doors. All staff must attend the general meeting at noon. Whispers spread quickly through the corridors. Some said the hospital was being sold, others claimed new management was coming with strict rules. By the time noon arrived, the hall was packed with doctors, nurses, clerks, and cleaners, each buzzing with speculation. Nandi sat quietly at the back, her hands folded on her lap, her heart curious but calm. The room fell silent when the double doors opened. Everyone expected to see a government official or a wealthy investor. Instead, the man who stepped in left them stunned. It was the same frail patient many had dismissed days earlier. But now he was transformed. Gone were the shabby clothes and tired posture. He walked tall, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, confidence in every step. His presence filled the room before he even spoke. Gasps echoed through the hall. Nurses exchanged wide-eyed looks. Clerks froze, and even Matron Dube's stern face faltered with confusion. Murmurs ran across the crowd. Wasn't that the poor man from the ward? How could this be? The man walked to the front and adjusted the microphone. His voice was steady, carrying both warmth and authority. Good afternoon. My name is Tawanda. Some of you knew me as a struggling patient, but today I stand before you as the new owner of this hospital. The words dropped like thunder. A ripple of shock spread, leaving the hall in stunned silence. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces before him. Some looked embarrassed, others nervous. I came here not to test your skills, but your hearts, he continued. I wanted to see how the sick are treated when they have nothing to give. What I found showed me both the best and the worst. Nandi felt her chest tighten. She realized at that moment that the man she had helped in quiet compassion was someone far greater than she imagined. The whispers around her grew louder, but she stayed still, her heart pounding. For everyone else, it was a revelation. For her, it was the beginning of something life-changing. The hall remained heavy with silence after Tawanda's revelation. Every staff member sat stiffly, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for what he would say next. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but piercing. While I was here, weak and in need, many of you turned away. Some of you ignored me as if I did not exist. But there was one person, one nurse who saw me not as a burden but as a human being. A nervous ripple spread through the crowd. Heads turned from side to side, whispers rising. Matron Dubé shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her jaw tight. Tawanda raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. His eyes softened as he spoke again. When I could not pay my bill, she used her own small salary to cover it. When I was lost in paperwork, she helped me without asking for anything in return. She reminded me that true care is not measured in money, but in compassion. Gasps broke out when he turned and pointed across the hall. That nurse is Nandi. Every head swiveled toward her. Nandi's face flushed, her hands trembling in her lap as whispers grew louder. Some eyes were filled with admiration, others with envy, and a few with shame. Tawanda smiled warmly at her. This nurse showed me what medical ethics truly mean. She gave me dignity when others took it away. The room erupted with mixed emotions. Applause from a few, guilty silence from others. Matron Dubé looked down at her desk, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Tawanda's tone shifted, now firm. Those who mocked compassion will find no place in this new chapter. Neglect and cruelty will not be rewarded here. He announced demotions for supervisors who had failed their duties, including Matron Dubé. Shock rippled again. Then, turning back to Nandi, he said, For you I offer a promotion, a salary increase, and full scholarships for your brother's education. Because kindness should never be punished. It should be honored. Nandi's eyes welled with tears. The hall filled with applause, this time louder as she stood in disbelief. What had begun as a quiet act of compassion had now changed her entire life. The hall grew tense as Tawanda's words echoed against the walls. Faces that once looked proud now drooped with shame. Matron Dube, who had spent years ruling the ward with a cold fist, sat stiffly, her eyes flashing with anger but her lips pressed shut. Tawanda's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke. Those who neglected their duty, those who treated patients like transactions instead of people, will no longer lead here. Titles will be stripped, and authority will be placed in the hands of those who understand what true care means. The announcement fell like a hammer. Several supervisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispers of dismay circling the room. When Tawanda finally named Matron Duba among those to be demoted, gasps broke out. She inhaled sharply, her pride wounded before the very staff she once commanded. For years, she had believed harshness was power, but now she sat powerless, watching the balance of respect slip away. Then Tawanda turned, his expression softening as his eyes found Nandi. But for every act of cruelty, there are sparks of kindness that light the way forward, he said. His voice carried warmth now, filling the silent room with hope. Nandi, you showed compassion when you had every reason not to. You chose humanity over comfort. For that, you will not go unnoticed. Nandi froze, her breath caught in her chest. She had never sought recognition, never imagined her quiet sacrifices would be spoken aloud in front of the entire hospital. Tawanda continued, From this day, you are promoted. Your salary will be increased and your family will no longer carry the burden of struggle alone. Your brother's education will be fully covered by scholarships. Your kindness has built a future not only for you, but for those you love. Applause erupted, this time unrestrained and genuine. Tears welled in Nandi's eyes as she bowed her head, overwhelmed. Around her, some colleagues clapped with admiration, others with envy, but none could deny the justice of the moment. In one sweep, cruelty was humbled and compassion was lifted high. Later that evening, after the meeting had ended and the hallways grew quiet, Nandi was asked to meet Tawanda in his new office. Her heart raced as she entered, still unsure how to face him outside the crowd. The room was simple but elegant, freshly arranged for his leadership. Tawanda rose from behind the desk, not with the air of a powerful man, but with the warmth of someone carrying deep gratitude. Please sit, he said gently, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Nandi lowered herself nervously, her hands clasped together on her lap. She had never imagined speaking privately with the man who only days earlier had appeared as a helpless patient. For a moment, silence filled the room as Tawanda studied her. His eyes softened, carrying both sorrow and admiration. Nandi, he began slowly, when you helped me, you reminded me of someone I loved deeply, my late mother. Nandi looked up, surprised. He continued, his voice quieter now. She was a nurse, just like you. She believed that every patient deserved dignity, no matter their wealth. Watching you, I saw her spirit again. The same kindness, the same courage. Nandi's throat tightened. She had never thought her simple act could reach someone's heart in such a way. Tawanda leaned forward, his tone firm but full of sincerity. You must know this. What you did was more than charity. It was a light in a place where many had grown cold. And because of that, I will stand by you, not just as the owner of this hospital, not just as your employer, but as someone who believes in your dreams. He promised her opportunities to grow, to pursue further training if she wished, and assured her that her family would never face the weight of struggle alone. Nandi blinked back tears, her voice barely steady as she whispered, Thank you, sir. Tawanda smiled warmly. No, Nandi, thank you. You reminded me that compassion is the greatest wealth a person can hold. In that private moment, their bond was sealed, not through power or status, but through shared humanity. Weeks later, the hospital no longer felt the same. The air, once heavy with coldness and fear, now carried a quiet sense of hope. Patients were greeted with smiles, and the staff moved with a new sense of responsibility. At the heart of this change was Nandi. She walked through the corridors with confidence, her white uniform crisp, her steps steady. No longer the quiet nurse hiding in the shadows, she now carried herself as a leader. Nurses who once whispered behind her back now looked to her for guidance. Following her example of kindness and integrity, she checked each ward carefully, not just glancing at charts, but stopping to speak with patients, asking how they felt, listening to their worries. When a patient looked anxious, she held their hand, assuring them they mattered. Young nurses followed closely, watching how she treated everyone, not with distance, but with dignity. Always remember, she told them softly, medicine heals the body, but compassion heals the heart. Under Tawanda's leadership, changes had swept through the hospital, but it was Nandi's influence that gave those changes life. Supervisors now thought twice before dismissing a patient's concerns. Staff who had once been indifferent now showed care, inspired by the story of how one nurse had reminded everyone what it meant to truly serve. Even the patients noticed. They whispered among themselves about the nurse with the gentle smile, who had made the hospital feel human again. One morning, as Nandi passed through the reception, she paused to watch a young boy help his grandmother walk inside. The sight filled her with quiet joy. She realized that her small act of compassion weeks ago had not only saved one life, but had reshaped the culture of the entire hospital. As she stood there, her smile brightened, and in her heart she knew this was just the beginning. The struggles of her own life had not broken her. They had prepared her to change others. Because the compassion you give freely is often the seed that changes everything.